Hey, Through Crosses family, welcome back to the podcast. Today, we are closing in on the end of our Kingdom Codes series. We are in Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 to 27. And today, we're talking about building a faith that lasts. We've got a great conversation in store for you. And with that, let's go deeper. Well, joining us today to talk about building a faith that lasts, by popular demand, we have Austin Payne. Austin Payne.
Wow.
Welcome.
The applause. Amazing.
Do you like our new toys around here?
I do. I'm a big fan. Hello, video.
We at one point were talking about we should have a studio, and that your wish is our... Yeah, we got it. So again, if you're listening on the podcast, feel free to tune into YouTube. We have a lot of fun on these conversations.
Yeah.
And
you
now
can
we
see AJ's
gotta look at
beautiful
each
face.
other.
Yeah, it's perfect.
But hey, you get a beautiful passage. We're rounding the corner on the Sermon on the Mount, and we are getting close to the end. A passage that maybe a lot of people have heard already, the house upon the rock, you know.
Yeah.
The wise man built his house upon the
Come on now. Ian, look out for your job, bro.
Hey.
Look out for your job.
Worship team 101 there.
Hire us.
But I'm just going to hop in here. Verse 24, talking about, it says this, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock." We're going to get into all this different imagery here. But one of the things I loved about the Sermon on the Mount series, I feel like at the end here, we get to talk about the highlights of where we've been. I feel like one of the highlights was your be-do, be-do, be-do.
Yes. It's a good
That
highlight.
has stuck with so many people I've talked to on Sundays, this whole concept of being something and then that leading to doing something. And I kind of see it here in this opening passage where somebody is hearing the words of the Father, and when they hear something, then they put them into practice. So there's like this mutuality going on of hearing and doing. And so I was thinking about that be-do sort of motif. I was wondering if you could just take that one soundbite and just help us remember where that gets played out in the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, because it seems like it's an important concept right here at the top of this verse. Hearing these words, putting them into practice, being and doing.
Right.
Where do you see that in the Sermon on the Mount playing out?
Yeah, I mean, I really think it's kind of a lens to look through for the entire Sermon on the Mount, right? Like I feel like left on autopilot, we all fall into do, be, right? Like if you think about a plane not being flown by a pilot, like actively hands on the wheel. Is it wheel? Rudder?
Sure.
I don't know. I've never flown a plane. Well, one time, but that's for another time. Like if you're not actively paying attention to finding your identity, like placing that identity in Jesus as a child of the God of the universe, as a son or as a daughter, like we slip into this like performance-based, like I do, therefore I be. And I think like the beauty of the gospel is like in Ephesians 2, it's by grace you have been saved. And then it's like, this is not of your works. This is not of your doing, so that nobody can boast, right? Nobody can say like, because of all that I do, I be. Like the gift of the gospel is always coming back to that. Like, no. While you were still sinners, Christ died for us, like just at the right time. Romans 5, you know, like this concept of like, it is not based on your performance. And then the Sermon on the Mount is all about performance, right? It's like, it's all about like how you are living this life. Like, are you angry or are you not angry? Are you lusting or are you not lusting? Are you worrying or are you not worrying? It's all about like the practical, tangible, day-to-day living of a life. And so I think the tendency is to autopilot slip back into like, I have to respond to all of these things in obedience, but then that obedience is where we find our identity. And I think the freedom that comes from like gospel first understanding, like none of my salvation is based on my performance. Deep breath. Now I respond day in and day out. Like I'm invited into this way of doing life, which is the entirety of the Sermon on the Mount. Like I feel like that's like a lifelong journey to constantly go back to that, right? To daily walk with Jesus. Like it's not as simple as like square peg, square hole, like check box, like done. It really does feel like a daily pursuit to view the Sermon on the Mount as like an invitation into a way of doing life, but from a place of identity.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's like a thing that has been challenging, because I know the scriptures sometimes in some places tend toward do, a lot. And it feels like when you review the Sermon on the Mount, like you were saying, there's just so many ethical teachings, ethical corrections. You see like, hey, we should be asking, seeking, knocking, living according to the golden rule, following the narrow road, identifying false prophets, doing all these things, doing the will of the Father. And now we land on another passage about hearing and doing. And I think of across scripture too, I think of like the passages at the end of Moses giving the law of like Deuteronomy 28, where it's like, if you do what I ask you to do, there's like 14 verses of all the blessings. But if you don't do it,
right?
There's like, I'm looking at it, verse 15 to 68 of all the things that could go wrong. And so it seems like there's an emphasis on do. And I hear what you're saying about this tendency to go from do to be. I wonder, and this might be something that I'm wrestling with as a Christian who's been in the church for a while now. I hear a lot of messages about who we are. And then it kind of stops there. It kind of stops a little bit short about works, because there's this like tendency to say, this isn't works-based salvation. It's all about who you are in Christ. It's about what Christ has done for you. So I'm wondering, what about you mentioned that the struggles of having a faith that's do be. What if the person's faith, or somebody out there, your faith is simply, I just know who I am and I don't have anything to do, right? So in the terms of be do, I'm simply being something and I'm not doing it. What's the danger of separating the two and living a life that is only be?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's possible.
Okay.
Maybe it is. Like, that feels just like such an incomplete faith, right? Like, which a lot of people have probably. Like I feel like if you're coming to church once a week and checking a box and going like, cool, I'm a Christian, like you get your dose of Jesus for the week. And I don't want to say that like lightheartedly or judgmentally. Like I say it like from a place of like I want you to view the depth of relationship that's offered to you, if that's like our approach to Jesus, which it can be. Like for me, working in a church, it's easy for me to go like clock in, clock out, preach a message. This is for you, not me. Mm-hmm. Like it's really easy for people in ministry to slip into that. And I think that's why we see so many like Christian leaders in the last decade, right, falling. Like not a single listener on this podcast would be surprised if I was like, hey guys, there's a Christian leader out there. He's like fallen from grace. He's stepping away from ministry. We'd be like, yeah, we've heard it before, right? Like that's not unfortunately, sadly, that's a very common narrative. And I think it's because of this like, be not do mentality. So like when I say it's not a thing, I mean like in actuality, it's not a thing, but like in real day-to-day life, unfortunately, I think we do slip into that of like, yeah, I'm a child of God, but then it has no bearing on the life that I live, right? It's just it's a blanket statement. It's a 30,000 foot identity, but that's not actually fleshed out in the way that I day-to-day live my life. Like I think about the parsing of spiritual life and I don't know, secular life. Like we separate those things, and it's easy to do as pastors to go like, oh, well, when I'm at church, when I'm pastoring, when I'm counseling, when I'm on stage, right? Like think about like you ever heard somebody say like, it's crazy, like he's exactly the same off stage as he is on stage. Like people used to say that about my old boss all the time, like Chris Brown. They'd be like, you meet Chris Brown, he's the same off stage as he is on stage. And I'm like, why is that a shocking statement? Like that should be the case, right? Like you should go, this man or this woman has the character to be able to handle the stage or the pulpit. And I think that's one of the scary things about the modern day pulpit is like, it's only in the last couple hundred years that's become like an elevated position. Like before that, it wasn't necessarily this like, oh, that's the goal or that's the dream or that's the like main pursuit is to like get on stage or to be behind the pulpit. And so I'm kind of making it about pastors, but beyond even just like ministry. That's probably where I wrestle with it. But like your day-to-day not average, but like your follower of Jesus that's not in vocational ministry, you can also slip into that like, no, I'm a Christian. That's my identity. But then it doesn't actually have a bearing on my life, right? And that's why like I'm so passionate about preaching at Three Crosses or being a part of a church that goes like, hey, we're going to teach this on a Sunday so that it has a bearing on your life on a Monday, right? Like we're going to teach this on a Wednesday night to my high school students so that it changes the way you do Thursday, right? For my young adults, we're going to teach on Sunday night so that it changes the way that you go into your week. Like that's the entire goal, is the fusion between spiritual and secular, so that 168 hours of a week, you're walking as a spiritual being, going, every single one of us is being spiritually formed, whether you know it or not, right? That we're constantly being molded. And so the question is not if you're being molded, it's like what or who is doing that molding. And I think that's the do, right? That's the like fusion between the be and do. That's like, it's really hard to separate the two of those things.
Yeah. And I wonder too, if, some of us maybe have just been like intellectually stimulated from the Sermon on the Mount, and it just kind of exists there. I feel like Western culture has valued knowing a lot and learning a lot, and yet I love the Sermon on the Mount and how it ends, because it just keeps beating the drum of that connection between be and do.
Right.
And so here we have another one. Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who builds his house on the rock. The verse continues, the rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. We'll take a look at the inverse statement coming up. But man, just thinking about the Sermon on the Mount, I've been so astounded by the way Jesus is able to use these like profound images. So I'm thinking like salt of the earth, kicking it off. Look over there, city on a hill, birds of the air, grass of the field clothed with lilies. Talking about the eye, like the lamp of the body, the speck in the eye, the plank in the eye. Using dogs and pigs, out of all things.
Right.
Wild, feral dogs and pigs. Bread versus stone, fish versus snakes, wolf and sheep, and all these different languages about trees and thorn bushes. My question to you, thinking about just Jesus's wizardry, maybe that's not the right word, but
yeah, there he goes, back to Harry Potter.
Back to Harry Potter.
Here come the complaint emails.
Jesus's amazing tendency to use imagery. How about that? Jesus's
there you go.
Amazingness, profoundness with looking around him and saying, hey, look at these things. What do you think he's getting at with the rock, the rain, the streams, the winds? What do you see in this imagery that stood out to you in your studies?
Yeah, I think Jesus is the master teacher, right? Like he's so good at meeting people where they're at. And like he did it both ways, which is what makes Jesus so incredible, is he oftentimes like uses language that's intentionally confusing, right? Like I think about like Mark chapter 4, he teaches the parable of the seeds, and those that got it, got it. Those that didn't get it, didn't get it. For whatever reason, the disciples don't get it. And they come to him afterwards and they're like, what do you mean seeds and thorns? And he's like, how do you not get this? Right? Like Jesus was so often, like, I don't know if it was like frustrated. It kind of seems like frustrated. I don't think it was like short-tempered or angry or frustrated in a way that was, short with them. I think he was like loved them deeply, but he was, I think it bummed him out that they were missing it. And there's this invitation deeper, which is what we spent a lot of time yesterday talking about, or on Sunday, talking about this like invitation deeper. And so Jesus uses these parables, like these simple stories that everybody would have related to, with just this like deep meaning. And sometimes they were very confusing, but sometimes it's like you look at a word picture and you're like, yeah, like that makes so much sense. And he seemed to thread that needle perfectly to give an analogy that everybody listening would have been like in an agricultural society would have understood, right? There, you think about Luke 16, like a man who had 2 sons. You're like, cool. Yeah, like I'm tracking, right? Or like a man who had 100 sheep and he loses one of them. You're like, awesome, yeah.
Yep.
Like a woman who had 10 coins and you're like, loses one. Like they lost a coin. It's like there's so much of this imagery in these parables that Jesus uses that every one of his listeners would have been tracking immediately. And yet there's this deeper, it almost seems like Jesus is like, there's this surface level catch, and then there's this like deeper lure that if you're looking for the deeper lure, you'll find it. And it's, if you want to be discipled, which just meant learner, right? The word disciple means learner. If you wanted to learn, it was there to learn. But if you just wanted that surface level catch, you could understand it. It's like, it's almost this like double meaning to everything Jesus said, with this invitation deeper to go like, if you want it, you can find it. And then every once in a while, John chapter 6, we mentioned this briefly yesterday, right? Jesus will teach something gnarly and then crowds of people leave.
Right.
Like, you don't hear about that very often, but it's like, there are parts of Jesus's ministry where hundreds, if not thousands of people went like, wait, what? Like, oh no, that's not for me.
Yeah.
Right?
Eat my flesh, drink my blood.
Crazy, right? We should do a whole podcast episode on that. But like, that's a crazy teaching. And the disciples, like the disciples who had seen him do all the things and like teach all the message, they go like, this is a difficult teaching. And Jesus literally looked at them and said, what about you? Are you going to leave too? Right? The rich young ruler, he walks away sad because he's a wealthy man. And Jesus doesn't go, whoa, wait, that's not what I meant. I think about that in today's context. Like, if we taught a sermon and then like people got up from their seats and left 3 crosses, like, I'm not Jesus. So massive caveat there. I probably said something dumb that caused people to leave. I am not equating myself with Jesus, but like, we don't do that, you know? And it's like I think what you're after is an invitation challenge that is like held together as one. Like, there's deep invitation. You cannot say that Jesus didn't invite. Like, there's constant invitation, but then there's high challenge. Right? And I think that's like, ultimately every one of us wants to be in relationships and on teams and a part of churches that are high invitation, high challenge. I want to feel like I belong. I want to be known. I want to be seen. I want there to be high invitation, but I also want there to be high challenge. I want somebody to keep me accountable and push me and challenge me and grow me and disciple me, you know?
Yeah, I think it even goes back to, you know, how is it possible to hear his words and not do anything? Well, I think they're gravitating toward whatever he's teaching just to kind of hear it and but they haven't gone for that deeper lure, you know?
Right.
I love that imagery because like you can see how Jesus ultimately is after people's hearts.
Right.
And that's maybe why he preached in parables. He was after their desires. He was after them coming to him for wanting more and coming after him. So, man, I think that's such a powerful thing. I know I kind of did a little nerding out on first century weather patterns.
Yes, of course you did.
Because I was sharing yesterday when we were having a conversation about this passage about, I don't know if I'd be too intimidated by rain, but that's because I can pull out my phone and like look at the weather app and be like, oh, it's going to rain. Right. And I can prepare for that. And we have a lot of technology and all that stuff. And yet the weather patterns, you know, first of all, you don't know. Second of all, it's a hot, dry climate. So it gets really hard and deceptive sometimes. So like the surface level might seem like it's a firm foundation. And because it's a lot of work, it takes a lot of time to get to the rock underneath to get to that firm foundation. And then you just end up with these like sudden storms in the Near Eastern culture that almost test the foundation. And so it's just a fascinating experiment and thought exercise to get into the shoes of that first century audience, listening in, and man, what would have resonated with them? What is that deeper lure that Jesus is trying to get into their hearts to draw them closer to him? And I think that deeper lure comes with the other side of this parable. And so I'll read the parable again. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. And so we have these two juxtaposing statements, and a lot of comparison, contrasting has been done in different commentaries. And one of the things that comes up a lot is this is a unique passage where Matthew draws a distinction between wise and foolish. And so it's a very unique word that occurs 6 times in the book of Matthew, no other times in the Gospels, this word foolish.
Interesting.
And so I wanted to ask our beloved skeptic question right here, because I can hear a lot of skeptics, having sat through our Kingdom Code series, being like, this way of life kind of stinks.
Right.
It's kind of robbing me a lot of the joys that I really like about life. You're telling me to control my anger. You're telling me to not act on what I desire, what my flesh wants. Like, you're telling me to keep my word even when it's really difficult. You're telling me to love my enemies. You're telling me to do things to develop this relationship with this God that I can't see. You're telling me that he's a good father, and yet, all this bad stuff is happening in my life or in this world. You're telling me to invest in this kingdom that I cannot see. My skeptic question, aren't Christians the foolish ones here? Aren't Christians the foolish ones? What makes Christianity the wise road?
Yeah, first of all, I think if a skeptic actually came up to me and worded it like that, I'd be so proud of them.
I know.
For actually voicing that.
We have a lot of educated skeptics out there.
Because I feel like most people would feel that,
right,
and not voice that. And if you feel that and wouldn't necessarily voice it like that, probably what you end up doing is coming to church 1 to 2 times a month. And just I'll just go when it's convenient, because I'm not fully bought in, but I'm also not ready to reject the God of the universe and turn my head on this thing, because hell might be real.
Right. I'll hear what he has to say, but
and there's things in the Bible that feel like they're a good idea. We see a lot of people coming back to the church when they have kids, which I think is the coolest thing. It's you have a kid and all of a sudden your life isn't about you anymore, right? I think about I think it was Martin Luther that defined sin as incurvatus in se, the Latin of curved in on oneself. That is the nature of sin, is when your life is inherently about you. And a lot of us walk around acting like that, myself included. When you have a kid, you're immediately forced outside of yourself, right?
100%.
Your whole life, you realize very quickly, your kid does not care about you and your preferences at 3 a.m., right? It's I have my own needs, and you, adult, will meet these needs. And so I think as soon as you're a parent and you have a kid and you want something for that kid, you realize church is probably a good idea. And so we see these parents bringing their kids back to church, which is cool. So you think it's a good idea for them, but not for you. Yeah. And then you see parents start realizing oh, maybe this is a good idea for me. So I think what I would say to that skeptic, first of all, is I think that's a really cool, honest take to go I'm going to reject this because it's too hard. Whereas I feel most high school students that I see, and then drifting into young adults and probably adults, say that's doing Christianity all out, like a super Christian. That's too heavy. That's too much. And so I'm just going to kind of settle for this middle ground of I'm not ready to reject it. I'm not an atheist. I'm just not going to be a super Christian. I'm not going to be a John the Baptist sold out. That's for the pastors and the missionaries and the theologians. And so I love it when I encounter people like that are wait, what? And that are honest enough and willing to have that conversation with me. I'm let's go. But I think what I would say to that person is that skeptic, look at what the definition of wise and fool is all throughout Scripture. The whole book of Proverbs defines the wise person as the person who's open and willing to be dependent on other people and hear advice and counsel and be willing to believe that they're wrong about something. The fool is somebody that just shuts their ears off and says I got this, right? It's the proud, it's the self-dependent or independent person. The proverb says the beginning of wisdom is this, get wisdom. That's one of my favorite verses. It's the beginning of wisdom is this, start somewhere. Get wisdom, seek it out, because the wise person will always be wiser still, whereas the fool just shuts their ears off to the world. So is the Christian the fool who's making life more difficult? Maybe initially, right? I think on a surface level, maybe go back to that like analogy of like the surface bait versus the deeper lure. Like I think on the surface, you might look at the Christian and go like, what are you doing? Like, why are you giving away 10% of your money every month? Like, what do you possibly, like, why? That's your money. You worked hard for that. Like, why are you loving your enemy? Like, that's your enemy, right? But I think you'd be hard pressed to look at any community and really like study that group of people over a long period of time and look at a Christian community that's actually practicing the way of Jesus and say like, those people are fools. Like I've had friends of mine come back to the faith because they have gone out, they've deconstructed from Christianity, gone out and like done a full synopsis on the way of the world and gone, that's bankrupt. Like, again, surface level, you go out, you do some drugs, you drink, you sleep around. Like your first couple of weeks, maybe even months of living that lifestyle are going to be like, this is way more free. I don't feel bad about it. There's no conscience. I'm not giving away my money anymore. If that person hates me, I hate them too. Like, it's like, it feels like the prodigal son, his first like 2 weeks in Vegas, right? Where you go like, I got dad's money. I got a posse around me because I have dad's money, right? I'm doing this drug. I'm sleeping with these girls. Like I'm gambling every night. Like, dad doesn't know anything. Like this is the freedom I've been craving. But like nobody was like, that type of freedom isn't sustainable. And that's where I think like the book of Romans, I think it's chapter 4, talks about like we are either slaves to sin or slaves to righteousness. It's like, notice there isn't an in between. It's like you're going to be a slave to something. And so for me, like I feel like a part of my personal testimony is like my first 2 years at college, kind of going away from what mom and dad knew. And it wasn't for me ever like a rejection of Christianity. It was more of a like older son, prodigal son going like, I kind of want to touch the stove a little bit because I've heard that it's hot, but like, is it actually that hot? And like, I always tell my students, I'm like, sin is fun. Like if you don't think it's fun, you're probably doing it wrong. And the reality is like sin is fun, but at the end of the day, it's like fun is not the goal. And it feels like this cup of water that's like has like a crack in the bottom of the glass where you constantly have to fill it back up. Like I think I grew up hearing like money can't buy happiness, and now I'm like, it can buy you a boat, right? Like, and a boat is really fun and a truck to pull it, and a great country theologian. But like the reality is like that type of fun isn't sustainable. Like you've never met somebody trying to have fun in life that's like had enough fun or made enough money. It's like this, it's this bottomless void that you constantly have to fill. Like you got to go to the next party. You got to get the next promotion. You got to make the next million or the next 10 million or land the next contract, win the next championship game. And so I think it's like this endless pursuit. Whereas like Jesus says, like, come to me and you'll be satisfied. Like come to me and you'll be fulfilled. Come to me and like watch me invite you into this journey that is life and life abundant, life and life everlasting, because it's not about you. And I think that's like the secret to the kingdom is once you unlock that, sure, it might look like foolishness, right? It's like the gospel is foolishness to those that don't believe. It's like there was a carpenter 2,000 years ago that lived for 30 years. And then all of a sudden, 3 years, he started teaching this lesson. He claimed to be God, and he died and like, quote unquote, resurrected himself from the grave. And that makes an impact in 2024. Christianity's wild. Like when you really start thinking about some of these things, it's like, it's bizarre. And if you grew up in it, you normalize a bunch of it. But if you didn't grow up in it, like if you're brand new to this thing, which I get to have these conversations in the Bay, like almost on a weekly basis with people that are new to church. And I go like, oh yeah, this is super weird. And yet, like, I would say, like, go beyond that surface level. Like, look at what the actual invitation of Christianity is. And I think it's the greatest gift of all time. It's like, it's the thing that captivates me daily. And I have to come back to it. I have to be reminded of it because I miss it. Like, I love this quote. This is the last thing I'll say. I was texting with a friend of mine a couple of weeks ago. I was, like, wrestling with it's this whole thing I don't want to get into, but it's like I was wrestling with insecurity ultimately. And she said this. She said, insecurity equals God's gracious gift of awareness as to where we're trying to find security outside of him. Let me say it one more time. Insecurity equals God's gracious gift of awareness as to where we're trying to find security outside of him. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's the answer to this skeptic's question is like the world is grasping for security in a million different ways. Mm-hmm. And like Christianity, Jesus says like, come to me and I'll show you what security actually looks like, because it's not about you. It's about me. And like everything beyond that, even as a follower of Jesus now, it's like my days where I'm insecure, it's like all it is this gracious reminder of the places that are still in my life, like the little corner that I'm holding out on. And Jesus is like, hey, that thing right there, like you're still trying to find security outside of me in that. Right. And I go like, dang it, you're right. And I got to like give that back to Jesus. But that's like that be-do fusion. It's like, that's the thing that I'm chasing after. Like that's the ongoing sanctification process of becoming more like Jesus.
Yeah. It reminds me that these are kind of disciplines. That's what discipleship means. I mean, it's in the word.
Right.
Like there is some semblance of discipline, and yet that search for freedom is not necessarily escape from all discipline, like you're saying, but finding the right ones. Right. Finding the ones that lead to life.
Right.
And I feel like a big part of this equation is where Matthew draws from this foolish, wise paradigm. The other place that he does is Matthew 25, which is the parable of the 10 virgins. And they're drawing their lamps, and the foolish 5 virgins don't bring enough oil in preparation for what's to come in the future. And then the wise ones are juxtaposed because they brought more preparation, more oil to prepare themselves for what's to come.
Right.
And so I feel like a large part of this conversation near the end of the Sermon on the Mount has been built on life looks different if we know what's coming. You know, life looks different if there is this end in mind that Jesus seems to be propitiating here. And so we see in the passage that another commonality is that the streams and the winds and the rain, they all beat against the house. They all beat against the house. It's kind of interesting. They're translated in English the same word, but they're not in the Greek. So prosopeson is the first beat against, where the one is built on the rock. And it is, moving against force, but it's also used to like talk about worshiping somebody, like falling prostrate. Super interesting. The second one, prosikopson, which is slightly different, striking against, but it also carries like this violent tone. So like even there's like differences that we might not be able to meet with our English eye. But beyond that, I'm just struck by Jesus's landing point, so focused on, there's going to be things that come and beat down your house, and it's either going to stand or it's going to have a great crash.
Right.
Great crash. Some of the manuscripts even have exceedingly great crash. And so I'm going to ask you a question that I asked Pastor Randy last week, because if you just tally all of these concluding statements, we see in 7:13 that there's this wide and easy road that leads to destruction. We see in 7:19 that there is bad fruit and bad trees, and they get cut down. We see
like our redwoods,
and thrown into the fire. Yeah.
Rest in peace.
R.I.P. In 7:22, we see God saying, "Away from me, you evildoers," on that day of judgment. And now we see the house built on the sand that's going to have this exceedingly great crash. Man, it seems like Jesus is using a strong arm tactic, trying to scare us into a way of life.
Yeah.
Tell people who are out there, man, this has just been a really heavy ending to this. Why do you think Jesus would land the plane here on this exceedingly great crash that's in store if we have our house built on the sand?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think you could decontextualize Jesus and make him seem like a doomsday preacher, you know? Like if you just like reeled Jesus.
Right.
Like took like these like, you know, nowadays we take like the presidential debate and we cut up like 2 sentences of it and go like, cancel whoever it is, right? Yeah. It's like, and some people, you know, whatever. But like it's, I think you could do that with Jesus. You could like chop up things that he say and like go like, yeah, he's using scare tactics. But I think like when you look at Jesus's teaching as a whole, right, if you looked at all of it in one piece, what you would see is like a high invitation, high challenge, I think you would see Jesus deeply love the people that are around him and invite every single one of his followers, listeners, to come and follow him and to practice the way of Jesus, right? Like I think about, he says like, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. Nobody gets to the Father except through me. That's an insanely exclusive statement, but it's also spoken to everybody. It's like, right. Hey, this is open to anybody who's willing to come, right? John chapter 3, verse 17, right? Jesus did not come to condemn the world, but to save the world. Like there's this invitation, and yet Jesus didn't shy away from the reality that we are souls that temporarily have bodies, and that life is more than just the right here, right now. Like I think about the amount of scripture that says like, if none of this is real, like if eternity isn't a thing, if Jesus didn't resurrect, then like eat, drink, and be merry, right? For like, what else does life matter if there's nothing beyond this life? And if Jesus didn't resurrect from the dead, then Christianity is foolishness. Jesus isn't worth following, and live for today. Like just be a hedonist, like live for the ultimate pleasure. But I think like the whole point of Jesus's teaching is life is more than just the here and now. Like if Jesus was just about coming and like being a good teacher and like improving people's lives 1% or 10% or whatever it might be, then like think about the countless people that he didn't heal. You know what I mean? Like I think about all the people, like Mark chapter 2 is the most, or might be chapter 1, is like the most obvious statement where like when all these people get brought to Jesus's door, and then he goes out the next morning and he prays by himself, and the disciples like come and find him and they're like, Jesus, like people were knocking down the walls trying to get to you because they heard what you did last night. And Jesus says, let's go to the next town.
Let's move on.
And you're like, what? Like that's a crazy, like I always think about the guy who like somebody came and knocked on his door in the middle of the night and was like, yo, we found somebody that can heal your little girl. And then like that guy wakes his little girl up, like marches across town and only gets told like, hey, Jesus went to the next town. And you're like, how disheartening that moment is. And yet like what's Jesus's ultimate goal is like, it wasn't to improve, like it wasn't just to simply improve like our physical life now. I think there are parts of like Jesus's message that legitimately improve your physical life right here, right now. But it's so much more than that. It's like Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, but then homie's gonna die again, right? Lazarus, his physical body will die again. And so what did Jesus come to for Lazarus? Is like to actually talk about hell and to talk about heaven and to talk about like the great crash, if you will. Like there's a certain part of this passage that is eschatological, talking about an end time, talking about a judgment day when every single one of us will come face to face with the God of the universe. And it's like the question will be asked, what is your life built on? Is it the rock or is it the sand? And I think about like, we talked a lot about like earthquakes yesterday. Where were you on October 17th, 1969? But 89. I was like 69. That's all right. 89. It was a 6.9.
There you go.
Was the magnitude of the earthquake. But yeah, like I think about if you didn't think an earthquake would ever come, or if you didn't think a fire would ever come, why would you care about how you built your house, right? Sure. Like, why are there earthquake codes? Why is there fire codes? Like, why do you have to put a fire suppression system in a room like this? Why do we have firefighters and Alameda County that comes out and inspects the way that you poured the cement piers of your deck or whatever the permit process is? And like, as maddening as that whole process can be, if you're like building or doing new construction, there's also a part of it that's like, we build a certain way because we're preparing for the big one, right? We were joking about how that was like the childhood, like the big one's coming.
It's coming.
It's coming.
It's still coming. I don't know when.
We'll see. But I think there is something about that that's like Jesus is playing on that analogy of like how we build, right? It's like we've all built a masterpiece sandcastle and then watched the tide come in. And it's like, it doesn't matter how much detail you paid attention to at the sandcastle against tide wins 10 for 10. Right. But it's like the house that's built on the rock that has that foundation, right? How much imagery does the Bible use about like Jesus being the cornerstone? It's like when you build that way, it doesn't matter the storm that hits, right? Jesus says, like, in this world you will find trouble, but take heart, I've overcome the world. So it's the storms of the here and now, but then it's also like on Judgment Day, Hey, what's the foundation of your life built on? The cornerstone, the rock, Jesus, right? My salvation is found in him and him alone. That's the ultimate storm. It's the judgment day. On that day, my house will not fall because it's not dependent on me. And if it was dependent on me, it would fall with a great crash. But I've heard these words of Jesus's. I've put them into practice. I've found my identity. I've lived it out. And that's what like gives my life that foundation.
Yeah, it's so good. Man, the Sermon on the Mount has been a wonderful journey. It's
so
been
good.
so challenging in so many ways. It's been so insightful in so many ways.
Let's run it back.
Let's run it back. Let's do it all over.
Run it back.
Start from the beginning. Blessed are the blank.
Yeah. Honestly, we probably could. And we could do that for a couple years, and I think our church would still have a lot to learn.
Yeah. And
Any church.
I know you've been a big part of this Kingdom Code series, especially throughout the summer. What do you hope that people got out of this series? You know, if you had to leave people with one thing, and it could be the one thing that's standing out to you the most that like, hey, this is what I want to share. Or just like the one takeaway that you hope people get out of this Kingdom Code series, what would it be?
Yeah, I think it'd be the lure. Like it'd be the
just the analogy.
The analogy, the deeper lure. Like
the deeper lure, yeah.
I don't know. I keep going back to this. If I was sitting listening to the Sermon on the Mount, like think about how overwhelming that would be.
Yeah,
to
totally.
sit on a hillside and listen to Jesus preach the Sermon on the Mount. And if you don't believe me that that's overwhelming, like just read the Sermon on the Mount or put it on like the Bible app or whatever, and like listen to the Sermon on the Mount from start to finish and go like one sermon. Like imagine if we did that. Imagine if we just like read the Sermon on the Mount start to finish on a Sunday morning and went like, cool, ready, break.
Right.
Like how many of our people would be like, oh, cool, got it. Like which part of that was convicting? Like which part of that are you going to live out? Which part of that is your action step for the week? And so I think, my long story short, right, I think what I would say is like, just keep walking with Jesus daily. Like watch how, I just remember early on following Jesus, like my life was so like up and down. Like I just felt like it was this roller coaster of like some days I was like pumped on Jesus and like showing up to church all excited, and other days I was just like not feeling it and like didn't enjoy reading my Bible, and church felt like such a, I don't know, like a have to, not a get to. And now I feel like, I don't know, probably 10, 15 years into like actually following Jesus, like choosing to myself rather than it just being like my parents' faith or my youth group's faith or whatever it might be. Like, I just feel like it's a lot more consistent. It's a lot more stable. And a lot of that is like, I still get excited about things. I still have meh days with Jesus, but it just feels like that deeper lure is this thing that I'm constantly going like, okay, I see the surface level Jesus, but like, what are you doing here? Or like, what are you after? Or what are you, right? And it's fun to look in the rearview mirror. Like I write a lot of stuff down, and I'll occasionally crack open like an old journal and see something I was wrestling through or some like biblical passage that didn't make sense and go like, oh, that was cool. Like it's cool to wrestle with that. And I'm just excited to keep doing that in my life. Like I can't wait to be the 42-year-old pastor and then the 52-year-old pastor, and just look back at like at 32, I thought I knew what the deeper lure was. Like I just know enough to know that I don't know, you know? And so I think that's like the Sermon on the Mount. You're not going to get it all. We're not going to get it all. But like there's an invitation to go deeper. Like the whole purpose of this podcast is like, let's go deeper. What if our whole congregation just had that desire to go deeper? Like to show up to church, but then go like, well, what's the next step? What's the community I can plug into? Where's the place I can serve? How do I go deeper? How do I learn more? And then a year from now, look back and be like, oh, wow, you thought you knew then. And then 5 years now, look back, you know? I think that's the cool invitation from a series like the Sermon on the Mount. Is like, we took, I don't know, 25 weeks.
Something like that, yeah.
To walk through one sermon, and we still don't get it. How cool is that? Like, just keep going deeper, keep chasing.
Yeah. I think we should say hi to 42-year-old Austin right now.
Hi, Austin.
Hi, Austin.
Hi. Hope you're still alive.
And then now let's say hi to 52-year-old Austin.
Nice. Nice.
So that when you come
if
back to this podcast. If
this is still around in 20 years, that'd be crazy. Some like AI version of myself is listening. Yeah. I don't know how that's going to work,
but it's been a journey, and, you know, going along with the theory that we even proposed way back in our Ask, Seek, Knock episode, I feel like this perfectly aligns with like the blessed are you when people insult you. You know, the flood and the rain coming down, persecuting you, falsely saying all kinds against evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And I think the one thing that has stood out to me the most is just God is after our hearts. You know, there's this beware line in chapter 6, verse 1. And that has really stood out to me. Like, what is the difference between a heart that's after God and a heart that is distant from him, just doing all these things, saying all these things, and really knowing who God is? And I think that is something that we can say until we're blue in the face, and we can preach on that. And yet, ultimately, it comes down to us, because we know what's going on in our hearts and in our souls. And like, I think it's worth spending time with. Yeah, in the end, will God be able to say, I knew you, not I never knew you?
Right.
Instead, or will you say at the end, like, Lord, was I doing all these things? I was trying to obey you. And yet there's something about the heart that, yeah, he wants to lure us into that relationship with him and go deeper with him. And so, yeah, what a great ending episode on the Sermon on the Mount.
I want to cry.
We have a studio now.
It's great.
We've grown a lot over this sermon series.
We really have.
We're on YouTube now.
Come on.
And we just shouted out 52-year-old Austin Payne.
Let's go.
So when he watches this episode, he can smile.
Get us on TikTok. Come on.
With that, I will do one more round of applause, because I got a lot of emails saying that we should use our sound system more.
Wow, okay.
Because they heard the horn in one of our episodes,
Nice.
and they got angry that we haven't used it. So
Nice. Can I choose one random button?
go ahead. Click the button and
I like
see what
this one.
happens.
It was just randomly the horde. That's awesome.
Sermon on the Mount. Austin Payne, thanks for hanging out.
Come on, AJ.
We'll see you next time.